This is a book all about Jesus Christ and how much greater he is. Jesus is better. And I won't rehearse it right now because we'll go through it at points during this message, but the context of the people that were receiving it, they were being tempted to leave Jesus and turn away from Jesus. And so this letter, which was at first a sermon, is all about the greatness of Jesus. And it's really, if you want to think about it, pillars of greatness. The premise of this letter up through maybe halfway through chapter 10 is giving us theological realities about the greatness of Jesus. Jesus is better than. Jesus is better than. Jesus is better than. And there's 4 pillars that the author sets up as showing us that Jesus is better than. And those pillars are in chapter 1, we see Jesus is better than angels. And chapter 2, Jesus is better than, into chapter 3 as well, but better than Moses. He's a better leader leading to a better destination. And tonight, we're going to look at, in end of 4 through 7, that Jesus is better than the priesthood. And the final pillar that we'll take up next time, in a couple of weeks, ShepCon as a break, is we'll look at Jesus as the better than sacrifices. He's the greatest sacrifice. And tonight, we're looking at priests. And this is a big one. This is, as far as pillars go, a significant pillar. Because, as we've learned, the audience that this preacher was preaching to was converted out of Judaism. So these were Jewish converts, and certainly some Gentiles amongst them, Gentile believers, but very well educated in the Jewish system, very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, and culturally coming out of Judaism to follow Jesus. And the priesthood was a massive part of Israel's religious dynamic. And of course, for us today, 503, I think, years post-Reformation, or is it 505 years post-Reformation? As good Protestants, we would not want to admit that priests have, or the priesthood has a significant place in our religious dynamic. I think when I say that word priest, you immediately think of the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps, and the priests that oversee the Mass. And so, being good Protestants, we would adamantly deny that anything priest has nothing to do with our religious belief. And yet, it does. Because the simple reality that no one approaches God without a priest. And without a priest bringing a sacrifice. We need a priest. And this need for a priest began in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve sinned. A separation was created between mankind and God. The first response to mankind's sin in the garden was for God to slaughter an animal and cover Adam and Eve with the animal's skins, setting up what would become evident as you read through the scriptures, a system of sacrifice and intercession between God and humanity, because fellowship had been broken. You know, in those early chapters of Genesis, we discovered that in order for us to have a relationship with our Creator, we need a system in place, a system that allows us to reach God because of what broke in the garden. You know, before sin, this act of rebellion against God, there was perfect relationship. And think about all of the perfect relationships that were in place. There was perfect relationship, animal between animal. The lion would lay with the lamb. There was perfect relationship between what we would see as the inanimate objects and animals and humanity. There was never a miserable day because humidity was just too much and overbearing, and it brought out the mosquitoes that are attacking us. There was no such division there. Everything was perfectly peaceful, perfectly delightful. And there was perfect fellowship between God and man. It's alluded to in the opening chapters of Genesis that God walked with mankind in the cool of the garden. No reason to be afraid of God. No brokenness in relationship. But when Adam and Eve sinned, enmity was introduced between earth and humanity. There was now a curse. God tells Adam it will be by the toil of sweat and pain that you rule the earth. The thorns will seek to overtake. And that's been the history of humanity ever since. Have you ever noticed that if we leave a town abandoned, that very quickly the earth itself will destroy that town? The earth is after us to destroy us because of the curse that sin brought. There was now enmity between animal and animal, between people and animals. There was even enmity introduced between the closest bond on earth between a husband and a wife. And most significant of all, between God and humanity. And so because of that sin and the introduction of enmity, mankind could no longer walk with God in the garden. They could no longer simply approach God because God is holy, and now humanity is unholy. There's a couple points through the Old Testament that really illustrate that. Psalm 50:21 is a reminder when the psalmist says, speaking of God to his people, "You thought I was one like yourself." God saying, "I'm not like you. You're sinful. I'm holy." Habakkuk tells us that God cannot look upon evil with approval. He can't tolerate sin. And in a very succinct statement, Isaiah communicates really the major issue with us. Isaiah 59:2, "Your sin has made a separation between you and your God." And friends, this has caused significant trouble for us. It's the greatest problem we have as people, that our relationship with God has been broken. It means we incur the just wrath of God, the penalty for our sin. And quite frankly, it doesn't take long to convince you all of the problems that come from this brokenness. Our world is broken, isn't it? It's ravaged by sin, death, and destruction. But God, being gracious, has made a way. He's actually instituted a system, a way by which humanity in their sin can approach God. And we see that system when God kills an animal and covers Adam and Eve with that animal's skin. What he's communicating is that in your skin, you're filthy. But this innocent animal has not sinned and will therefore cover you in your sin. This system will go on to be elaborated all throughout Israel's history, with the sacrificial system whereby a priesthood was set in place, a line of men who were chosen by God from among Israel to represent the sinful people to God. And we'll learn a little bit about that priesthood as we go this evening and some of the ins and outs of that system. But in essence, what it was God said, as he looked at his people, that this people cannot approach me. And so I will select from among them several who will stand in between as mediators, who will offer to me sacrifices on the behalf of the sinful people. And it's only through this priesthood, through this mediator, this intercessor, that I can commune and talk and fellowship with my sinful people. And what we're going to learn tonight is that Jesus Christ is the greatest priest, the greatest go-between God and man. We're going to learn it in these 3 chapters. There's a really cool kind of segment or division, and we're obviously going to have to go pretty quickly in 30,000 foot view here, but I want to kind of give you the lay of the land so that you can, as you dig in deeper, understand what's going on here. He introduces this section in chapter 4, beginning in verse 14, by talking about Jesus Christ as the great high priest. And he says a few things about Jesus here that are pretty remarkable. And then as we get into chapter 5, the preacher kind of slows down and gives us a background of the priesthood, to kind of explain the priesthood. And then goes and shows us how Jesus is the greatest. He's greater than the priesthood that was established under Moses, even. But then we'll see this interesting. Oh, okay. So that's point number one. I'm gonna give you the points here. Point number one. Better than Aaron, and that'll be explained to you. But better than Aaron. That's verses 14 of chapter 4 through chapter 5, verse 10. And then in the middle of chapter 10 through chapter 6, point number 2, I'm labeling it better things, and we'll see a fascinating little diversion that the preacher takes. It's kind of cool, especially I've kind of geeked out over it this week as a preacher myself, because it's interesting to see what the preacher does. But he communicates that he has a desire for better things for this people, and we'll understand. The first rule in preaching is you never use things because it's too vague. But actually, here it fits perfectly, and Joey wouldn't let me not use it. But then what the preacher does is he actually comes back to his first point. And I'm going to do something maybe you've never heard a preacher at Grace do. You ready? My third point has the same title as my first point. Have you ever heard a preacher do that? Sweet. It's hard to stand out here. So point 3, better than Aaron. And that's all of chapter 7. So point number 1, better than Aaron. Point number 2, better things. Point 3, better than Aaron. Really communicating a lot with these points. But we'll see. We'll see what he does. It's pretty cool. It's fascinating. So the preacher opens up in chapter 4, verse 14, introducing this section. The next probably, 3 minutes of his sermon is about Jesus is better than priests, right? The greatest priest. And he starts with this line. Listen to this. Chapter 4, 14. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. He's just introduced this concept of priest, and Jesus is the great high priest. So don't let go of Jesus. For verse 15, we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. This section on the priesthood of Jesus is introduced by labeling Jesus the great high priest. And notice what he says about him. He's passed through the heavens. It's kind of cool because the priests that would represent Israel to God in the Old Covenant would go into the tabernacle, into the Holy of Holies, the place where God had established that his presence would specially abide. And once a year, the high priest would, through a meticulous series of preparatory events, what he had to wear, eat, be, do, wash, once a year he'd go into that special place where God was and atone for the sins of the people. Now, because God was accommodating us, he put that special place on earth and said, you know what, guys, I'm gonna abide here on earth. Okay? So come in and I'll be there. But what the author says about Jesus immediately is great high priest. Immediately they're thinking Holy of Holies. He's passed through the heavens. So here you have Jesus soaring through the heavens to go to God where God dwells above. Okay, so already he's being set apart here. As this isn't the normal high priest activity. No high priest was ever like, okay, it's the Day of Atonement, guys, so I'll see you. And just soaring up through heaven. They're going, where'd he go? No, they entered the physical space God had provided, but Jesus soars through the heavens. He's going straight to the throne. And he's called the Son of God. No priest was the Son of God. Now notice this, he's sympathetic. We do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus he got us because he was truly man. And yet, notice what he says, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, so he gets us, but without sin. He's man, but he's God. And because of his priesthood, we can enter and stand before the throne of grace with confidence. Friends, really, I want you to leave tonight confident that you have an intercessor who stands before God on your behalf. I want you to leave tonight holding on to Christ Jesus with greater hope, confidence, and surety than you ever have before, going, he is my mediator. He is my way to God. I have no other way to God. I have no other standing before God. It's Christ. I'm holding on to Christ. As he soars into heaven, I'm holding on his coattails and soaring with him to the throne of God, where I receive everything I need. Mercy and grace. We really could end there because that's the goal. This crowd was losing confidence. Is there a train? What is that? This crowd was tempted to let go of this high priest and actually go back to the old order of priesthood, which hopefully by the end of this message, you'll think, that's ridiculous. Well, why would you ever go back to that system? But they were tempted. And so the preacher is like very graciously coming out and, if they're going like this and loosening grip, loosen your grip real quick. So here's the people, they're loosening their grip. This is getting weird quick, but they're loosening their grip on Jesus. And you know what the preacher does in this sermon? He comes and he goes, no. Don't loosen your grip. Hold it. So he's going to do that. Now, he could end right here and just skip 3 chapters, but he doesn't. So in chapter 5, verse 1, he gives a bit of backstory on the priesthood. Look what he says. Every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts, sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. I love that. All the priests, they can deal with us as ignorant and wayward, because they are too. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. There's the introduction of Aaron. He goes into the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of Aaron. In Exodus 28, we see the institution of this priesthood. As the people are established as Yahwehists, the people of God, God tells Moses to call out Aaron and his brothers and make them the intercessors. And their line will be high priests, and from their tribe will come the priests. Not everyone from the tribe of Levi was a priest, but the priest could only be from the tribe of Levi, the tribe from which Moses and Aaron came. And he teaches us here in these opening 4 verses some things about priests. They were chosen from among the people. They were sinners. They were weak sinners, just like the people. And they were chosen to represent the people before God. And the priests would have a sympathy, because they're from the people, because they're also fallen men. So the priests would not come in arrogance and go, really? Sinned again? Huh? Okay. Wow. 3rd time, David, this week? Okay. Must be running low on sheep. Yeah, I'll take it. Because they themselves had to offer sacrifices. because they were just as sinful. And so there was a sympathy there. And the last thing that he kind of tells us about this priesthood was that it was chosen by God. No one just went, yeah, I'll do it. No. God selected the priests, which meant there was nothing inherent in them necessarily. It was the sovereign election of God. I said at the start, we don't really like priest talk as Protestants. But the priesthood meant everything to Israel. There was no religion without them. There was no way to God without them. No priest, no salvation. You don't walk on Sinai. You don't talk to God. You do not approach the Most High. You have a priest. So that hit them differently than it hits us. Because sadly, we've come to assume the priesthood of Jesus. But without the priest, there was no forgiveness. And so he explains and kind of rehearses this priesthood. And of course, the people would be going, yes, we know this. But then what he says next, beginning in verse 5, is actually a culturally shattering statement. A life-altering statement, because he introduces Jesus as a priest. Look at verse 5. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, just like those men didn't. He didn't exalt himself, but was appointed by him who said, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." As he says in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then he talks about his priesthood in verses 7 through 10, how Jesus became a priest through what he suffered, offering up prayer and supplication with loud cry in his humanity, probably a reference to Gethsemane, where Jesus submits himself to the will of the Father in death. Obeying though he suffered, being made perfect. And notice what he says in verse 9, becoming the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Wow, Jesus is a priest. Now, the preacher is about to take us down into the depths of this priesthood of Jesus. And there's a lot here. He's comparing Jesus to what he just said about the Levitical priesthood to show them, see, he's a priest. They didn't select themselves. He didn't select himself. They were people who sympathized. He's a man who sympathized. He's correlating, saying, see, do you see? He's drawing it out for them. And he's about to take them deep. He's about to, grab the hook and just dive to the depths of the ocean of priesthood. You see that because he introduced, did you hear Psalm 110 in there? The 2 times Melchizedek is mentioned. Melchizedek who? Like, huh? He's about to take them back to Davidic prophecy, back to Genesis, before Israel was even founded as a nation. He's about to go into the deep stuff of priesthood. This is the time when the seminarians are like, oh yeah, baby. This is what I came for. But he stops. Look at this. This is a fascinating little observation about this sermon. He's like diving deep into Jesus. He mentions Melchizedek. He's about to take him there, and then he goes, verse 11, about this we have much to say, and he does. And it's hard to explain because it is. Since you've become dull of hearing. Point number 2, better things. From this verse in chapter 5 through chapter 6, verse 20, the preacher enters into a sort of exhortation / rebuke / warning. It's here where so many people ask about the question of chapter 6 is, can someone lose their salvation? I mean, this is such a popular section of not only Hebrews, but the New Testament, riddled with questions. And it comes in the middle of a seemingly interesting spot where he's about to enter this almost technical explanation of the priesthood. And then he pauses and goes, you know what? I've got a lot to say, but it's going to be real hard because you've become really dull of hearing. Look at this, verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles, the basic oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. You know why I like this as a preacher is because there are moments where you have your manuscript, right, Teru, you have like your plan. And you ever had that moment where you're going tracking, but then you're feeling from the people there, maybe they're not with me. So you go, you know what, let's circle back. So what I meant by that is, and then you leave the manuscript for a second because some of these people aren't tracking with me. So you pause. There's almost this sense that in the delivery, and then it, is transferred into the letter because it's invaluable what he says. He's going into this priesthood, but then he senses, you know what, I don't think some of you are with me. I don't think some of you are getting this because you've become dull of hearing. That word dull is lazy, bored. It's almost like calloused. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher. Blah, 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 blah. Talking, but I'm really not listening to what you're saying. I've become dull. Your voice has become white noise to me. And for some of them in the church, he's worried that they've become bored, lazy over these realities. He wants to give them Melchizedek, but they need milk. So he pauses. He pauses to give a rebuke of sorts, but more of really an encouragement to keep up. Let's listen in for a moment to that pause, okay? Verse 11, we already read. We'll continue on. Verse 13, everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness since he's a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God, and of instruction about washing, laying on of hands, resurrection of the dead, eternal judgment. The essence of what he's saying is some of you are immature. And I want you to notice how many illustrations he uses. And they're really helpful illustrations. Solid food versus baby food. This is steak versus applesauce. Skilled versus unskilled. See that in verse 13? You're unskilled in the word of righteousness. He says again in verse 13, there's this idea of being an adult versus being a child, mature versus immature, discerning versus undiscerning. So here, he wants to give them all the reasons they should hold on to Jesus, but he's looking out going, I don't know if you can take it. You've kind of gotten immature. And guys, I think this is really a place for us at Grace Church to pause. And I'll get to us as Valley in a second, but I want us to just stop and think of our context at Grace Church. Remember, he's speaking to a very educated people, at least educated in Judaism. I mean, when you read Hebrews, sometimes you're just like, what is he talking about? But they got it. He's bringing out all these Old Testament quotations, and he's taken them deep from chapter 1. I mean, chapter 1 is straight in. And they're tracking with him because they can. They can track with him. You know why? Because they know theology. So this is the kind of guy who doesn't have to open his sermon and go, okay, so in the beginning, This is the kind of guy who goes, tonight we're going to talk about the propitiatory work of Christ on behalf of the depraved sinners in the atonement. And you're going, yep, got it. Because they know it. Because they're educated. They've been around this stuff. They've been Christians for quite some time as well. And so they're tracking with him. And he stops and goes, you're hearing a lot, but I wonder if you're becoming dull in that hearing. And as I've been studying this, it's hitting me here. Because, guys, I'm reading the Bible all week. And I'm like studying the finer points of theology. And good heavens, man, we listen to like 8 sermons a week at Grace. And if you go to TMU, you listen to 26 sermons a week. Like, it's unbelievable how much intake. And yet then I look at my life and I go, am I obeying it? Like, is it changing me? Or am I able to go from a conversation about Jesus Christ soaring through the heavens on my behalf to stand before God as my mediator and then just walk out into a conversation and gossip and give myself to slander and criticism of others? I just don't even think twice and then walk right back into the talk about these. That's a dullness. Or this it's not affecting them. They've become tired of it. Or even maybe more accurate, guys, is the sense of like, yeah, isn't there something more? Like, Jesus, but isn't there something more? And isn't there greater things in life? And here, this congregation was threatening to leave all this stuff because they'd kind of been bored of it. And it really wasn't that impactful anymore. So they're going wandering over here and in fact looking back at their old life going, maybe that's where it's at. Now, I want to say this because Joey and I were talking about this, and one of the greatest joys about being here at Valley is I don't think I, in good conscience, could stand here and level this accusation at you. It's not really an accusation. Maybe it's an admonishment, a rebuke, right? Like, if I'm not in a position, I don't think that the preacher of Hebrews is in to go, Valley, you've become dull. Because Joey and I have found that you guys are sharp, pursuing the Lord as a group, pursuing Jesus, wanting more of him, to love him, to go deeper, saying, give us more. We want to give ourselves to the understanding of it and to the living out of it. And so I think Joey and I have to say we're ridiculously encouraged and would actually commend we have visitors tonight. This is a great place to get sharp. This is a place to pursue the Lord with passion and vigor. But that temptation's not beyond us. And I think we're susceptible to it, as they were. And the preacher really says it's an issue of maturity, guys, maturity. However, he goes on, beginning of verse 3 of chapter 6, to present a possibility that it might be worse than immaturity. You ready for my alliteration? Maturity or mortuary? Oh man, that's bad. I thought it was gonna sound better when I said it, but it didn't. But from verses 3 to 8, he says, I think it's an immaturity in you guys, but it could be an issue of spiritual death. And that's where he says, those who've come to taste the goodness of the Word of God, but nothing changes in their life. For them, it's not an issue of immaturity. For them, it's an issue of spiritual deadness. But notice how optimistic he is. He says in verse 9, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things. So, you can see, I'm not just being lazy with my titles. I'm getting my titles from the text, better things. On 2 counts. Better than immaturity and better than spiritual death. We are sure of better things with you. That you're not wallowing in immaturity and that you're not spiritually dead. Because, notice what he says, we feel sure of better things, things that pertain to salvation. Because God is not unjust to overlook your work and your love that you've shown in serving the saints. What he's saying to them is, church, I know you love him because I've seen it in your life. We're confident of better things in you. And yet, there's still the presence of the warning, which is so good. I need that warning in my life. That I'm encouraged, that I'm pursuing the Lord, and God is producing fruit. But I need that warning in my life that there is a temptation to become dull and to put this off. In verses 13 to 20, he gives this buttressing of their faith. And I wish we could spend more time here, but let me kind of just give you the framework for it. He says in verses 9 to 12 of chapter 6 that he's certain of their salvation because they're holding on to their hope. They're holding on through faith to the hope. And verses 13 to 20 of chapter 6, he explains what is that hope. And you want it in a sentence? It's the confidence that what God says he will do. That his saying is his doing. So if he's given you a promise, he's going to fulfill it. Hold on to that hope. Okay. Then masterfully, he transitions back to his point about priests. It's kind of cool. If you read the section, I'd encourage you to read 4:14 through 5:10 and then skip to 7:1 and just keep reading, and it's perfectly seamless. So he just stepped aside for a second and said, real quick, a few thoughts. Okay, back to priests. And it's almost like he's saying, I wonder if I can give you Melchizedek because you need milk. Okay, let's get Melchizedek. So it's like, man, if he had stopped there, we'd be like, no, who's Melchizedek? Or they would have been like, no, how does Melchizedek play into this? So he doesn't stop. He gives it to them, which is beautiful. So point number 3, better than Aaron again. Beginning in, really, I started this in 7:1, but it really begins in 6:19, where he says, we have the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Remember, I said, I want you to leave with confidence. Anchor of the soul. You drop that anchor and it's not moving. And what is it? It's the hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtains, the Holy of Holies, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest. Now, if he had stopped there, we've got a problem. But he goes on, a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. We've got a problem because you and I are probably not asking the question that these thoroughly Jewish educated believers would have been asking. And it's this: how can Jesus be a high priest? You and I really don't ask that question because we just learn about him as the high priest. But the Jewish audience would have been going, whoa, 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 whoa. Jesus cannot be a priest. He is not from the tribe of Levi. Only Levites can be priests. And he can't be a high priest because he's not from Aaron. So how is he a priest? Well, enter Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? He's been mentioned several times before, in chapter 5. But we've got to understand this interesting character, and let me try to give him to you in 5 minutes. Really, we would need to go back to Genesis 14 when we first see him. There's a fascinating account of Abraham. Remember when he asked Lot to choose where he'd like to live? And Lot chooses, ultimately ends up in Sodom. And there's a time that 4 kings from Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goim decide to take over the region where Lot lived. So these 4 kings come to take over a region where 5 kings were ruling. And they say, we want to live here. There's a battle. And the kings who ruled the region where Lot lived, the text says in Genesis 14, begin to run because they're overpowered. And so, of course, the 4 kings come, they win the war, they take over the region, and they take all the women, children, men, possessions, everything, including Lot. Oops. Somebody survives, runs to Abraham. They've taken Lot. Wrong guy to mess with. Lot gets like 316 or 18 of his buddies and goes, let's go. And in the dead of night, wreak havoc on the camp of the 5 kings, slaughtering and retrieving. An amazing victory. Now, watch what happens next. I should go there. Genesis 14. You don't have to turn there, but you can listen. Abraham has just won this incredible battle. And we read in verse 17, after his return, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham at the valley of Shavah. That is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. That's what Melchizedek says to Abraham. And listen to this. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. He tithes to Melchizedek. Okay? Back to Hebrews 7. I'll get there. What we discover in Hebrews 7, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, which means peace, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth of everything. And then he gives a little bio of Melchizedek. He is, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. Melchizedek means in Hebrew, King of Righteousness. And he is also King of Salem, peace, King of peace. Without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Now, this section could threaten to kind of mess us up in this whole line of argument. And we start going, who is this Melchizedek? He was never born and he never died. He had no father, no mother. This must be an angel. Maybe it's the archangel. Or maybe this is Jesus himself in a theophany appearing to Abraham. I don't think that's necessary. We know certain things about Melchizedek. He was a man who lived on the earth. He was a king who ruled. So the author is not telling us he's some weird creature that's divine. What he's saying is by refusing to give a genealogy, by refusing to give a date of birth and death, he is setting up Melchizedek as a type of Christ. A type, a foreshadowing, excuse me, of what is to come. Which is why in Psalm 110, that famous messianic psalm, we read that the Messiah will be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The point was not to get weird about some angelic appearance. The point was to look at this priest king who, now notice this, Abraham, the father of Israel, reverenced and gave tithes to. Now, why is that significant? Well, the author tells us why that's significant. He tells us that even before the Levitical priesthood existed, there was a priest that the father of all Israel bowed down to and tithed to. There was a priest that was greater than Abraham. You know what he's doing? he's showing us the type, the picture of a priest king who would come, not confined by the legality of Mosaic covenant, not confined to a certain bloodline, not confined to certain weaknesses and temptations from which Levitical priests all had and endured, but this priest who is shrouded in mystery and shrouded in eternity, eternality, and eternal rule, having no beginning and no end. There was a priest coming superior to the Levitical priesthood, a priest who would not only intercede, but would also rule, a priest who would sacrifice and command, a king priest. Ultimately pointing to the priest of Christ. There's a lot here, but I want to show you a massive point. Look at verse 25. The former priests, verse 23 we'll start, were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. The other priests died, but Christ never dies. That's why Melchizedek is such a perfect picture, because they didn't record his genealogy. He died on this day. They just didn't record it. Of course he died. He was a man, but he was painting a picture, pointing us forward to the priest that would never die, which means for you and me that he's always there interceding. His intercession never stops. The other priests had their own sins to atone for, but not this one. Look at verse 26. We have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Christ, the ultimate priest, who doesn't have to atone for himself, but atones for us perfectly. Where the other priests failed because of their basic inability as mere humans who were sinful and fallen, they could never save us to the uttermost. They could only point us to the one who would. And so we see verse 28, the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Jesus Christ, friends, stands between you and the Father, interceding on your behalf forever. He will never die. He will never fail. And his priesthood is after the order of a priest who transcended the Levitical law, who transcended the lineage of Aaron. And so he's saying to this people, why go back to the shadow when you can have the fullness of Christ representing you before God in heaven? Why go back to a priesthood which enters a little room where God's representative presence remains, when you can have a priest who has soared through the sky and on his coattails takes you to heaven itself, where you find mercy and grace in time of need? Christ, he is better.